Hey everybody, how you doing? My name's Chris. Today's video, we're going to dive into high availability or HA on the Fortigates. Now before I do that, this is my reminder. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. You can find all my old videos and blogs on my website, infosecforhumans.com. And of course, you should subscribe here for my latest and greatest content. So the way in my mind I have this video going, we're going to do some level setting up front, get on the same page so that we all know what we're working towards. We're going to discuss the lab environment that we're going to set up because this is an important one. How do you configure HA in a virtualized environment? I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. And then at the end, we're going to do 2 or 3 demos of the virtualized HA config and show you exactly how it works, and also a little bonus at the end, so make sure you hang around. So when we're talking about high availability on a network device like a Fortigate, what we're talking about is building in some redundancy to keep data flows on the network flowing. Now in this video, I'm only going to cover a basic HA config. It's going to be an active-passive config. For number one, it's the most common config you're going to see in an HA configuration for FortiGates. But number two, for the NSE4, you don't need to dive into the weeds. We can stay at a pretty high level. So first things first, let's review Fortigate HA modes. Now, in FortiGates, we have 2 modes. We have active-passive and active-active. Let's talk about active-passive first. With active-passive, there's a primary Fortigate that is active with 1 or more slave units that are not active. When I say not active, I mean they're not actively handling network sessions. The slave units are online, on the network, they sync the configuration of the primary to themselves, and they're ready to assume the role of the primary unit should it fail. Now, active-passive provides transparent redundancy in your Fortigate cluster to all the network around it. The synchronization is performed over dedicated heartbeats or HB ports on most physical Fortigates, but because we're using virtual machines in this lab, we don't have dedicated heartbeat ports. During our configuration of the HA, we're going to specify heartbeat ports. And like I said at the beginning of this, active-passive is going to be your most common. If you're walking into an environment that's already got high availability configured on the Fortigates, it's very, very, very likely it's going to be an active-passive cluster. So then that leaves us with active-active. Now active-active on paper sounds really good. It's like a load balancing. It distributes the connections and the security profile inspection work between members of an active-active cluster. The downside is you can't have an active-active, or you shouldn't, I should say, you can, but you shouldn't have an active-active cluster with only 2 Fortigates. You should ideally have 3, if not 4 Fortigates in an active-active cluster. Otherwise, the additional overhead of synchronizing all of the sessions across the Fortigates, across the pair, and in the example I gave, would actually be detrimental, and you would degrade the performance compared to an active-passive cluster. So let's move on to talking about monitoring cluster members, because that's a really important part in high availability. How do they know when a failover needs to occur? So clusters use something called a heartbeat. The heartbeat is sent by a cluster member and received by other cluster members. This is tracked, and should a cluster member fail to receive a heartbeat from another member in a given time period, the member is considered down. This would kick off a failover event. Moving on, second part of this, and this is equally important as the first part. The default mode for heartbeats to be sent between units is a broadcast, a layer 2 domain broadcast. Not layer 3, but layer 2. Because most Fortigates are deployed as physical boxes with dedicated heartbeat ports. They usually have heartbeat 1, heartbeat 2. I'll say HB1, HB2, or I might say HA1, HA2. These ports are directly connected to each other using patch cables. You can connect them to a switch, for example, in the cluster of 3 or more, but that switch should be dedicated to only handling that cluster's heartbeat traffic. You shouldn't have servers, clients, phones, etc. on there. It should be dedicated just to that, because you don't want to introduce instability that could delay a heartbeat. On the other hand, something to keep in mind is this situation doesn't exist with a VM. The VM's interfaces are connected to virtual switches. Because by default, Fortigates use a broadcast method for heartbeat monitoring, in a VM, it's easiest to use a different method called a unicast heartbeat. Using a unicast heartbeat, we can configure the cluster members with a layer 3 IP address that is dedicated for heartbeats instead of a layer 2 broadcast. So one last note before we move on, this is for anybody who's studying for the NSE4 and they just want to kind of say, well, what am I supposed to be getting out of this? What should I be focusing on? Just keep in mind, there's 5 other protocols that Fortigates can use for HA, and they're listed below. But for the NSE4, you only need to worry about FGCP, or the Fortigate Clustering Protocol. All right, let me fire up my super high-tech network diagram technology. Yep, there it is. Found it. So as you can see here, my workstation, I'm running VMware Workstation 15.5 as the hypervisor. I have this management network, which is really just my local LAN. And then I have Fortigate 1 and Fortigate 2. These are virtual machines. Each one has 2 ports. Port 1 is the management network. That's how I access it over SSH or HTTP. And then port 2 is going to be dedicated to a HA network. And this HA network is similar to what I talked about with having a dedicated switch for the heartbeat communications to flow, except for, like I said before, because these are virtual machines, we're going to be using unicast. So we're going to be applying a layer 3 IP address to these interfaces for the heartbeat ports, and those IP addresses are listed here. Now, if you want to follow along, I'm going to be posting the scripts that I use to configure these devices in the description, so you can grab those and maybe it'll help you out a little bit. Then last, here's the high-level outline. Here's where we're at. We're ready to get into the lab and demo outline. So first, we're going to download Fortigate VMs from support.fortinet.com. If you haven't seen my video already, you can do this for free. You get a 15-day trial of these VMs. You're limited to a gig of RAM, I think, and a single core CPU, but that's more than enough. You're not going to have any problems in a lab. And then we're going to import the VMs into VMware. Then we're going to configure the VMs in VMware and create that HA LAN segment. I'll show you how to do that. Then we're going to apply a basic config to the Fortigate VMs. Then we're going to apply a basic virtual machine HA config. And if you notice, I call that out because it's a little different. We're not going to use the broadcast, which is the default method for heartbeat communications. We're going to use unicast, and then we'll jump into the demos. And the demo, I'm thinking, let's take a look at what happens if we leave the priority in an HA config at default. What it is, it's unpredictable. You don't know which of the FortiGates is going to become the master. Number 2, we're going to modify the priority so we can predict and control which Fortigate becomes the master. And then number 3, I'll show you an extra little thing there that I think is really useful because, again, remember when you put your FortiGates into an HA cluster, you lose access through the normal channels to those slave units. You can't use SSH to get to them. You can't use HTTP, HTTPS. You need to use either create a dedicated management port for them, which is an additional step, or you can access them through the master unit, and I'm going to show you how to do that. All right, so step 1, head to support.fortinet.com and log in there with your credentials. If you haven't already, make sure you set that up. Then once we're in here, we're going to go to download VM images. On the right side, make sure FortiGate's selected. We're going to grab, because I'm using VMware Workstation, we're going to grab VMware ESXi. And I've already got these downloaded, so I'm not going to download them again, but I'm working on 6.2, 6.2.6. You can grab 6.2.7 if you want. This should work just fine on 6.4.4. It's pretty stable right now. Then once you have those downloaded, I always like to structure my virtual machine save folder in a way that the VM hard disks, the VMs themselves, are segregated into what I'm working on. So in this case, I'm going to make a folder called HA Lab, and I'm going to save my VMs into that folder. That way when I'm done, I can just delete that one folder. I get my disk space back, and it's neat and tidy and orderly. So this part here is filmed after I recorded everything else and was halfway through editing this video when I realized that my recording platform, OBS Studio, didn't capture the pop-up window that shows me editing the virtual machine settings, so it didn't do you a whole lot of good. So I'm re-recording this now, just a heads up if there's some continuity issue. That's what it is. I'm trying to avoid that problem, obviously, but I'm going to show you now what I meant to show you in the first place. Alright, so I'm recording this a third time because apparently every time a menu pops up in VMware Workstation, OBS doesn't know to capture it. So you can't see it right now, but I am right-clicking the VM tab at the top and then going to the very bottom, and you will see a settings menu. So go ahead and click that settings menu, and that pops up a new window. There it is. So once this window is open, we don't have to change anything in here except for this. We're going to go to this network adapter 2. And by default, it's on bridged. We're going to change this to the LAN segment. And then, bear with me here, we're going to click LAN segments. All right, you can see it there. That's the LAN segments. So in here, we're going to click add. And you can name this anything. It's completely arbitrary. I used subnets before, but you can use text like this, and that works as well. It's entirely up to you, whatever you want to call it. It's just, think of it as a layer 2 broadcast domain. It's a layer 2 network segment, so there's no IP addressing used. It's just connectivity for layer 2 devices. So name that. Oops. Remove that extra guy there. Click OK. All right, there we go. Click this here. We're going to select HA LAN. You're going to go to the second VM and you're going to do all those same settings. You're going to select LAN segment, but you don't have to create the LAN segment the second time around. You just have to select it from this drop-down menu. At this point, click OK to save the settings, and you're done with the LAN segments. No more. Now, if you haven't done this before and you're wondering, is this normal? Disk usage change? Please wait for reboot. Yep, that's normal. A new Fortigate VM, there's some housekeeping that needs to be taken care of behind the scenes the first time it boots up, and that's what it's doing here. But then the times after this, it's much quicker. All right, so while we're waiting for the VMs to boot up for the first time so we can apply the initial config, let's go ahead and talk about this basic config. So if you notice, I have this broken out here. Basic config for 2 Fortigate VMs. Again, I'm going to put this in the description so you can copy it. You'll probably need to change your IP address for your management network to match whatever your physical LAN network is, but you can still see what I need to do here. So this is step 1 for the primary, step 1 for the backup. This needs to be done through the VMware console, and then the rest of these steps, and I call it out here, you can do through the SSH. All right, there we go. Blew it up a little bit. It's still kind of small, but just bear with me. This is the initial step. Again, we're going to do the rest of this in SSH, and I can make the text a little bit bigger for you. So this is step 1. By default, FortiGates, when they ship, there's no password on the default admin account. So first time you log in, it's going to ask you to change it. And then once we're in here, we're going to config sys interface. We're going to edit port 1. We're going to give it that IP address. First, we're going to set it to mode static. Telling it we don't want it to use DHCP anymore. Set IP address 10.1.1. Oh, I need to turn my numpad on. 10.1.1.5/24. We're going to set the allowed access. There's 2 L's in allowed. Set allowed access, HTTP, SSH, and ping, and then we're going to end. And then we're done on that one. We're going to go over to the backup here. We're going to repeat those steps on the backup. Again, no password. So we'll create one. And then we're going to config system interface. We're going to edit port 1. We're going to set the mode to static. We're going to set the IP address to what we defined, 10.1.1.6/24. We're going to set the allowed access to HTTP, SSH, and ping. Now remember, because these are trial VMs, you don't have access to HTTPS. So for the purposes of the lab, set it to HTTP. If this was a production environment, you would want to use only secure communication methods, HTTP, SSH, etc. So now we're going to end it. And at this point, we should now be able to get rid of that tiny console screen. And then we can SSH admin at 10.1.1.5. And it's saying, hey, host has changed. I'm going to click accept, and we are logged in. It didn't ask me for a password there because I used MOBA exterm, and I allow it to cache my lab environment, cache the passwords for the lab environment, I should say. So again, same thing on the second one here, 10.1.1.6. Again, click yes, and we are in. So now, getting back over here to Notepad++, let's take a look at that. We have done the basic config to get basic connectivity, so now we can SSH into these virtual machines. If you're having trouble and you haven't, you're not able to SSH in at this point, pause the video, go back, take a look at the last few steps, make sure you didn't have a typo somewhere on there. You can do a show system interface physical, show system interface to make sure that you set allowed access, that you set the IP address that you expect to find in there, and just take a close look at that, because at this point things should be working. If you still can't get it to work at that point, go into VMware and make sure that you didn't select a NAT or some goofy network setting for that interface number 1, because that can also definitely throw you for a loop. So now that that's done, we're going to move on to There we go. All right, now that that's done, and now that you can see what the next steps are, we're going to move into step 2, which is continuing the basic config for the primary, and then continuing the basic config for the backup unit. So making sure I'm on the primary. Let's go back there. Yep, on the primary. So we're gonna do config sys interface again. Edit port 2. Now remember, port 2 on that diagram, that's for our heartbeat. That's for our HA LAN communication. So we're going to configure the IP address that I had specified there. First, we're going to set mode static. We're going to set the IP 172.18.05/24. Next, and that writes it. Then we're going to do a little bit of just some basic housekeeping here. Config sys global. We're going to set the host name to something that we can easily look at and say, hey, yep, that's our primary. So Fortigate primary. And then we're going to set the admin timeout, and this is the amount of time that the Fortigate will allow you to stay logged in before it kicks you out. And although this process is pretty quick, it's just, in my lab environment, it's a good idea to set this so I don't have any frustrations later on. So set admin timeout 480 minutes. Again, I probably wouldn't set that in a production environment, but it's good for your lab. Now let's move over here to the backup unit. We're going to do config sys interface. Edit port 2. Set mode static. Set IP 172.28.18. Whoops, 172.18.0.6/24. Then next, and same thing on the config sys global. Set host name, Fortigate backup, so it's obvious. Set admin timeout, 480 minutes. We're going to end. So at this point, we have a very basic config on Fortigate primary and Fortigate backup that has port 1 configured with a management IP address and port 2 configured with a predefined IP address that we're going to use for the HA unicast configuration. So now with that done, we can move on. Let's take a look at the part of the video that we're here for, getting into the basic HA config. Now let's step through this real quick. If you remember, I said we're going to do a basic config. We're not going to do anything really complex. We're going to do config sys HA. We're going to set the mode to active passive. That's what AP means. We're going to set a group name, which you have to. We're going to call it HA_lab. First time around, we're not going to set a priority. I just want to show you what happens when you don't do that. And then set HB dev, which is your heartbeat device. We're calling it out. We're making it port 2. And then 10 is a metric applied to that port. And then here's the magic for the virtual machine part. Set unicast-HB enable. That's what enables the unicast heartbeats, which is, again, just a reminder, not the default behavior. We're getting away from that broadcast, and now we're going to assign a layer 3 IP address. We're going to use a layer 3 IP address. In the very next step, we tell it, hey, here's your peer IP for your HA cluster member. And we set the peer IP to the IP address of the backup unit, not the IP address of the primary unit. Because remember, this is the primary config. We're telling it where you're sending your heartbeats. We're sending them to the other cluster member, which is the backup device. And that's the same thing down here, except for, again, calling it out. We're sending our heartbeats to the primary member because this is the backup device. So just make sure you keep those straight. You don't flip-flop them around, create all sorts of headaches. All right, make sure I'm on the primary. Yep, Fortigate primary, it tells me that. So here we're going to do config sys HA, set mode A-P, set group name, HA lab. Now group name must match between cluster members. Keep that in mind. So if you do a lowercase here and an uppercase on another one, that won't work. We're skipping priority. We're going to set the heartbeat device port 2 as we configured it already with a metric of 10. We're going to turn on the virtual machine magic. We're going to enable that. Set unicast HB-peer IP. Tell it where to send its heartbeats. That's 18.0.6. Then we're going to end it. So right now, if we do a Oh, there you go. Took a second. I was thinking after that. So show sys HA shows us the non-default configuration that we have applied. And you can see here, it's ready to go. It's looking for a peer at that IP address. Now, right now, it's not getting anything back because the other one isn't configured. So now keep in mind also, because we didn't define a priority for either of these VMs, without looking at the serial number, I can't tell you which virtual machine is going to become the master in this cluster. So we're going to lose SSH here to one of these once I configure what we're calling the backup right now. So get in here, do the same thing, config sys HA, set mode, A-P for active passive, set group name, must match the first one, HA lab, set the heartbeat device, port 2 with a metric of 10, set unicast, enable, set unicast dash peer IP, and this is the IP address of the primary on that port 2. And we're going to end it, and at this point, one of these we're going to lose connection to. And there you go. That's a good example of why you always define a priority, because we wanted this one to be our primary in the cluster, our master in the cluster, and it is looking like I lost connection to that one, and my backup is now the master. So that is a that's your real world scenario for setting priority right there. Now if we do get sys HA status, we can see health status is listed as okay. We go down here a little bit, and it lists the members of this cluster right here and right here is serial numbers. One is in sync, one is out of sync, which is normal. Immediately after you create a cluster, there's a period of time in which it's syncing configurations, and during that time the cluster status will say okay, and then you go down here and you look under the configuration status and it'll say in sync or out of sync. You just have to give it a minute, sometimes 5 minutes. Even though it's a virtual machine, there's basic configs on these, it still takes a few minutes to config. There we go. It is in sync. I timed that, and that took 6 minutes. So if you're doing this in your lab and it feels like it's taking an eternity, that's normal. It takes its time, but it's in sync. So now you can see HA health status is okay. We've got both units in sync down here, and we can run that again one more time, and we can see still in sync. So that is an HA config when you don't set a priority. So let's go ahead and I'm going to tear this down, rebuild it, and when I get back there, we're going to pick up on the HA config part, but this time we're going to set a priority. All right, there we go. So because I'm not using my brain, I didn't take a snapshot of when I initially stood these VMs up. I had to go through and reconfigure everything again. So here's a reminder. When you build your lab, take a snapshot once you get basic connectivity built. So moving on to demo number 2, let's talk about HA priority. So when we configure HA priority, which is not required, you don't have to configure it. As you've seen there, we didn't do it, and sure enough, the wrong Fortigate became the master in the cluster. When you set priority, the largest numbered priority on a member will become the master. So you have the option of 0 to 255. 255 is the highest you can go. That is the highest priority. That will become the master. So on this Fortigate here that we're looking at, 10115 or Fortigate primary, we're going to set the priority to 255. And then because we want 10116 or Fortigate backup to be the backup member of the cluster, we're going to set the priority to 128. So let's go ahead and work through that again. We're going to do, again, config sys HA. We're going to set mode A-P for active passive. We're going to set group name HA lab. Again, this must match between cluster members. And then here, setting priority is a big help. We're going to set it at 255. We're going to set the heartbeat device, again, to port 2 with a metric of 10. Set unicast HB to enable, turning on the virtual machine magic there. Set unicast HB peer IP 172.18.0 6, which is the IP of port 2 on the backup device. Just a reminder there. And then end. So I'm going to move over to the backup device and repeat those steps with a slight change. Config sys HA. Whoops. Set mode. Active passive. Set the group name. Set the priority. And because the other one's 255 and we want it to be the master, we're going to set this one to 128, which is lower than 255, obviously, making it the backup. Heartbeat device. Port 2. Metric of 10. Turn that on. Tell it where to send its heartbeats. And we're going to end it to save it. So now at this point, there you go. I've already lost my connection to Fortigate Backup because we had intended on that becoming the supplicant or the slave in the cluster. So if I move over here to the primary, we can see running that command that we ran so many times before, get system HA status. It'll tell you this one is selected as the master because it has the largest value of override priority. So we have a health status of OK. Again, it's saying in sync and out of sync, and that's normal. It's probably going to take about another 6 minutes here. I'm going to let it go ahead and do its thing, and then when we come back, I'm going to hit you up with the bonus. The little tidbit I think is super cool, very useful. All right, there we go. We are in sync. That took 4 minutes and 30 seconds for a cluster in a virtualized environment. So let's keep that in mind. It feels like it's taken forever. It kind of feels like it does. It's normal. So I'm going to stop teasing this last bit here. Like I had mentioned, when you put FortiGates into a cluster, you lose access to them, through SSH, through HTTPS, through the normal manual management process. You can no longer get to them. So how do you log in to run maybe debug commands on a slave unit in a Fortigate cluster if you can't log into it? Well, that's where this comes in. You can use a command called execute HA manage, and then we'll hit a question mark here, and it'll tell you, well, what ID do you want to manage? Or it'll just say 0, the subsidiary unit. So we're on the primary, as you can see there, Fortigate primary. If we want to log into Fortigate backup, the one that we can't hit over here, as you can see, it's not working. The SSH is disabled. We would do execute HA manage and then the number 0. Whoops. Forgot. I think it wants, local admin name. So if you remember, we didn't change local admin, so we're still using admin, which is the default credential. All it has is a different password on it. Execute HA manage 0 admin. We send that. Put in the password that we defined. And now we have access to the Fortigate backup. So if we needed to, we could run debug commands here to troubleshoot syncing issues. Now keep in mind, if you're troubleshooting syncing issues with your HA cluster, you're not always guaranteed to have access via this method. So it is a best practice and a good idea to set up a out-of-band management interface on clusters so that you can get to them. But this is in a pinch, if you don't have any other way to get to a member of a cluster other than the primary, this can be a very useful trick. So make sure you store this one away in the back of your memory. All right, that was a ton of info all at once. I'm going to do my best to try and break it out and chunk it up and put little marks in the video so that you guys can go there and take a look at it without having to watch the entire thing. Again, these are free virtual machines you can download from Fortinet. You can import. I highly recommend you go out and buy a VMware workstation license. You can use it so much. It's so very useful. You can do so much with it. It's definitely worth the investment. I'd say hang around for part 2 of this. Part 2 is going to be troubleshooting. I'll see how I can break this HA cluster, and then I'll show you how we can use some diag debug commands to troubleshoot it and pinpoint where the problem is so that we can then fix it, because I know that's a very common problem for a lot of people in the field, running into broken HA clusters. At this point, all I have left to say is my name's Chris Ray. This is InfoSec for Humans, where I help you level up your cybersecurity career. I'll see you next time.